Bog number 7 is Allan Smith. Allan was born in Toowoomba and played his junior football with Valleys Toowoomba. Allan played one Origin game, the inaugural match of 1980. Selected at 5'8", the mortal Wally Lewis named it lock. In all, Allan played 5 games for Queensland. After scoring 4 tries in the final Interstate match of 1979, Allan moved to Sydney, where he played 2 seasons with North Sydney before joining the Canberra Raiders for their inaugural season in the New South Wales Rugby League competition. In 1996, Allan became a Queensland and Australian selector.
Well, Allan Smith, thank you so much for your time. What does it mean to you to be amongst the FOGS, a group of Queensland Origin players?
I think it's a great privilege. You know, I grew up in an era where Queensland would struggle to beat New South Wales. And numerous times there was a Queenslander in that midst that made the difference. And it's hard to swallow when you're getting beat by players you've played with. You know, like in '79, I was playing against Langy and Bowie and those guys that are playing, and Rod Morris were playing in Sydney. And we were competitive. But in the end, we got beaten. And you know, and it was obvious, I think, during that period. You know, I was very proud of the fact that, you know, you would play at Lang Park and we'd get a full house. And I remember in '79, a great story. We've rocked in, Cracker's the coach, and we've gone to Leichhardt Oval to play. And we get towards close to the Oval and there's people everywhere. There's buses and, you know, great crowd. Oh my God, this is awesome. You know, we're going to have a good crowd. So we got in there and, you know, Crackers wind us all up. And unfortunately, there was a junior game on between Patrician Brothers and Fairfield High or something like that. At the end of that, they all went home. And there was about 3 men and a dog left in the outside of the Oval at Leichhardt to watch the main game between Queensland and New South Wales. So, you know, when Senator Ron pitched the idea of, you know, Queenslanders coming home to play, and I just felt that that was an opportunity to put the records right. And the years have proven that.
Well, let's go back to the start of that journey.
Yep.
What was it like growing up in Toowoomba on the Darling Downs as a young bloke? What was your childhood like?
Yeah, awesome. It was a great, you know, particularly Toowoomba, great footy team, you know, culture. You know, during that period, I played, you know, all through primary school. We had a primary school group that actually won the state championships, and I remember so well. We played the regional thing was in Toowoomba, and we actually played Brisbane. And there are a number of high-profile guys in the Brisbane side, and in the end, we beat them. And there was this panic because, you know, the organisers had thought nothing about what happens if anybody else but Brisbane win. So they had to run around madly that afternoon to try and organise billets and accommodation and transfers and all that sort of stuff to go to Brisbane for the following week to play the winners from North Queensland and Central Queensland. And they just couldn't believe that, you know, Brisbane would be beaten by Toowoomba. But, you know, in that side there was a lot of great players. Lindy was in that side. It was a great culture growing up. And, you know, getting into high school and playing in the, you know, secondary school, high school side for Queensland. And in that group was a bloke by the name of Darryl Broman. The most amazing, he was an amazing player in his ball skills and speed for a big guy. And we played New South Wales that had 2 front rowers, Royce Aleph and Craig Young, plus, you know, a number of others. So it was a great journey growing up and a great experience. And then my career moved into playing for Valleys. You know, we won the under-18 grand final, and then the following year I was playing first grade for Valleys. And Valleys are a very strong traditional club in Toowoomba, and they'd been very successful. But it was a bit of a lean period. You know, you run through some eras where, you know, we had some tremendous backs, but we were probably a little bit light in the forward department. Sorry to the forwards, but, you know, and we played against some really good players. You know, people like Greg Platts and his brother, and you know, a whole heap of, you know, guys from Pittsworth or Maroon that were just cockies during the week, but hard, tough footballers. And we had a great culture. Cracker turned, you know, I was there we played under-18 the first year that John had coached. and they went to Wide Bay and they got flogged. And Cracker, in his inimitable way, said, well, this has got to change. So he changed the culture of selection, and from then on, Toowoomba grew into a real powerhouse in country rugby league in Queensland. And, I was very lucky to play with blokes like Platsy and Rowan and a number of guys out of that Toowoomba group that were definitely great footballers.
See, times have changed. Country football is going through a leaner period now, and not only because of people leaving the land and heading to towns, but because the game
has changed.
Structure of the game has changed. But in those days, you didn't have to leave Toowoomba to represent Queensland.
No. A number of us, like I often was in the side with Greg and Rowan and that sort of stuff, and we were very competitive. We'd go through the whole process. It was quite unique scenario where, in essence, I played a lot more representative games than I actually played for Valleys. And that was a pretty hard pill for them to swallow at times. You take 2 or 3 of their best players out, and we'd play from Toowoomba, and we'd play, that used to be the old Bulimba Cup, which we'd play the Gold Coast, Ipswich, Wide Bay, and Toowoomba and there were some great players. Ray Higgs, and that was playing for Wide Bay, and there were some great players that played for the Gold Coast and Ipswich. And you'd play that round robin, and then they'd pick a southwest Queensland side, and then they'd pick a South Queensland side, and then you'd go to a country championships in Rockhampton or Townsville, and then you'd play North Queensland, and they'd pick a Queensland country side, and then you'd go and play in Brisbane. And during that period, we had coaches like the great what's his name? I've had a seniors moment. Jack Gibson came and coached. He brought his whole coaching staff and his car from Sydney and coached the Queensland countryside. It was quite amazing. He was an amazing bloke, Jack. We were very competitive for the first 35 minutes, and then playing against Brisbane, the class kind of kicked in, and we got a bit of a toweling. But it was an experience that that whole thing was, and you'd get to, and then you get picked for Queensland, and then play for Queensland against New South Wales. So, from about 1975 right through to 1979, I played a lot more what we'd call representative games than you would play for your club.
So you never felt that you had to go to Brisbane either? You were happy to stay in Toowoomba?
Yeah. So I was really happy. I'd had a great mate with Wayne Lindenberg. He'd gone to East, been very successful there. But, for work and for family reasons and all that, so I was quite happy to stay in Toowoomba. And there wasn't a huge monetary differential between the two. We weren't earning a lot of money in those days. But then after 79, I got an opportunity to go to Norths, and it was great. Just a change of atmosphere, experience in life. Probably at the back end of my life, it was more about the experience than it was about the football. But I loved my footy there. Got some great mates out of Norths. We did okay. And then they were on the move up, and people like Mark Graham, Freddie Arcoy, and the Mitchell Cox, and they signed those guys. And then Canberra came into the comp, and I was very excited. I spoke to Don, and that was another challenge and another experience in life that I was keen to experience. So we went and lived in Canberra for a couple of years.
So take us back to the 70s. You're playing for Queensland in the Interstate series.
Yep.
You head to Norths in 80. So you scored 4 tries in the final game of 79.
Yep.
Had you already been approached by Norths, or was that a trigger for then Sydney clubs to say, we want Allan Smith?
Yeah, that was a trigger, I think. At that stage, I think Ron Milley, who was the coach at Norths, was actually sideline commentating in that game. But as I said, I was bitterly disappointed because Kerry Boasted got man of the match in that match. I'm going, you're kidding. I got 4 tries in a beaten side, and Bowie, he was quite happy to tell me that, but he scored 3 tries for New South Wales. So I had a spare jersey in my bag, so when at the end of the game I swapped that jersey with Bowie. So I have at home the seven tries in and that's the game where all the crowd disappeared.
So how long did it take you to think about going to Sydney to play?
It didn't take me long. They flew Marie and I down for a weekend to have a discussion, and we flew out of Toowoomba down there. In those days, Toowoomba, there's about 2 or 3 restaurants in the place. You roll into North Sydney, and in the end we lived at Crow's Nest, which is about in a house about 80 metres from the Oval. It was a whole different lifestyle, compared to Toowoomba was basically a large country town in those days, and to go to the Big Smoke, it was quite exciting actually, and
a bit easier because you were, a little bit older.
Yeah, a little bit older. As I said, you learn some mistakes, and I probably should have worked harder. When I sit there, I was always super fit. I used to train with Cracker in the off season with all his professional runners, and Wayne and I would always do. And he was a great advocate of different styles of training, and would be running up the hills or going out to the race course and running straight 800s, or at the oval at the grammar school doing sprints with lead weights and all that sort of stuff. So he was fairly innovative in that thing. So I was always, between probably 74 and 79 was super fit for the Toowoomba comp. Probably if you learn things, I was super fit at the North, so always in the front group leading it, but probably should have worked a bit harder. But, I was getting a bit older at that stage and enjoying life. And, if I went back again, I would probably work a bit harder.
Had you given up hopes or thoughts of playing for Queensland? Because it was the Interstate series. I would imagine when you signed, Origin might have been briefly spoken about, but it was not on the radar.
Not on the horizon. It was the Senator was certainly pushing it. It was a concept, and what happened is that I went out and supported the guys that year in the two games. One was here in Queensland, and then there was another game at Leichhardt Oval. So I went out to that game and supported the guys, and it was they still struggled a bit, but then it started to gain momentum. So at the end of that year, the New South Wales won the first two games, I think, and they said, right, we're going to try this concept, State of Origin. So out of that group, we had some very good players in Sydney. Langy and Arthur got an opportunity that he had never had to play for Queensland. Rocket, the same. But you had, blokes from Queensland like Rowan and Wally. Wally was the superstar even in those days, and a couple of centres that were pretty handy, Choppy and Mal, and a couple of very good wingers. So, I think my role in that, same with Greg's, our job was a bit of the glue to hold it together, to give those guys that had the potential, to have an impact on the game, to give them the ball and be defensively strong.
When did you find out that you were going to play? Were you ever thinking that I'll be 5'8" and
No,
Origin
not
on?
really.
No.
Really. It was a phone call. I think they rang the club initially, and I go, wow, that's pretty awesome. Very high group of individuals, and I was excited. But, as I said, as much for Arthur. I'd had a little bit to do with Arthur, and he was a great guy. And here's an opportunity for him to play for Queensland, which he loved. And then he set the course for the next 30 years, I suppose.
What were your expectations?
I always thought we were going to win. I was confident. They flew us up the week before. We had a training session, went out to Corbett Park, and we trained out there. Cracker was the coach, and he didn't overcoach the side. We had four coaches in the side. Langy's always a great coach, no matter where he is. He would discuss tactics for about 5 hours after training. You had Arthur and Rocket, and Wally. A bludgeoning, getting into his stride, but the skill of those guys and just the knowledge was awesome. They'd say, this is where we need you, this is where we wanted to go. We just had to go out there and do our job.
Did you think it was a one-off, or did you think it had legs?
I thought it had legs. As I said, I know how much the Queensland football public love their footy, and to have a side that could win and beat New South Wales was always going to be a winner. And once you got that taste, you don't want to go back.
I think that every first gamer that I've spoken to, and by first game I mean 1980 original,
yes,
that I've spoken to and has been here having a chat with us, the one thing they mention about that first game at Lang Park is running out and the noise. What are your memories of game one?
Exactly that. I thought the group, we all went out, and they held Arthur to last. And the crowd, it was raucous at that stage. But once he ran out, and I still have the vision of Arthur, he's got, grease all over him, got his, sleeves rolled up. He was just enormous. And when he ran onto the field, as soon as he went over that sideline, the crowd erupted. And it's probably the loudest noise I've heard ever.
And the difference between that and an interstate series representing Queensland, not trying to demean either or whatever it may be, was it a step up, or do you rate your games in Origin in Queensland on a similar level?
I think it was a much better, higher level. You know, as I said, much skillful play. You know, you had Rocket and Langy, the professors of the game, and Arthur. You know, they were very tactical in what they wanted to do. So, you know, it was miles above what we did. You know, as I said, Cracker was a great organiser. He didn't have to do too much coaching. First thing, he only had a couple of weeks. But secondly, he had 3 or 4 of the best strategic guys that played the game in that one team. And I was always confident we had a game. But, you know, New South Wales had a pretty good side. You know, I'd played against, Sludge and what's the name in the centres?
Mick Cronin.
Yeah. And, you know, they were... I remember, you know, the first time I met or seen Sludge, we played an Amco Cup in, I think, 74, 75, one of those years. He beat me 4 times in the one movement and still scored. And I wasn't the only one. But he was a magic, you know, the speed and, you know, evasiveness he had. And Mick was a little bit different. He was a big guy, good offloading skills, strong. So they had a pretty good side. And, of course, they had Tommy. And, you know, one of those memories. Unfortunately, I had to room with Ollie, or fortunately. And every 5 minutes the phone and ring it'd be Tommy. Given Ollie, because they were roommates on the Kangaroo tour a couple of years before, he was giving him everything, you know, what he wasn't going to do to him on the night and how they were going to beat the crap out of us and all that sort of stuff. But in the end, I said, mate, I'm going to pull the phone out at the wall.
Do you reckon Origin would have been successful, had legs, as I referred to before, if Arthur didn't play? Do you think that was the biggest thing of game one, the fact that it was Arthur Beetson leading Queensland out?
I think it was the icing on the cake. You know, to have all those other players as well. You know, first of all, if we lose in a series, it never would have taken off. But, you know, I've always been confident in the ability of Queensland players. So just in those days, and the world has changed a lot, you know, we didn't have the great competition the Sydney competition was. It was a tough game every week. You know, if you're playing in the country, you're playing in Brisbane, yeah, there's probably some easier games. The intensity wasn't as strong as it is in the Sydney competition. So they were, you know, probably better educated and better skilled. Not so much better skilled, but, you know, more resilient, I think is the word. And, you know, they wouldn't panic. And he always had blokes that, you know, like Tommy, that I remember he replaced Steve Mortimer in a game. I think Steve threw a couple of passes that, you know, the crowd caught in the second row of the grandstand, and we were a chance in that game. First thing is, I think Ted Gloppis was the coach, and he swapped Tommy for Steve, and in the first ball, I think Tommy threw it straight in our second row, went round the corner and just belted the crap out of poor old Wally. And that was the whole difference, you know. Then all of a sudden the momentum changed, you know, their forwards started to get an impact. You know, we were right in it to that stage, and then he just changed the momentum of the whole game. So, yeah, I think if we lost, it wouldn't have been, you know, they would have just said, experiment that went bad.
Having been there in 1980 and having played in that interstate game in 1979 in front of a handful of people, can you believe what Origin has become today?
Oh, yeah, I think it's awesome. I still don't think the cockroaches understand it, but that's another story, and I hope they never do. But you just look at the crowd and the support that we get here in Queensland. You know, every game is not they don't talk about, it's always a sellout. And it's great that the Queensland public are rewarded with sides that, you know, particularly the last few years we've had some great sides, great footballers and some really interesting games. So I think that, you know, Queensland at heart probably embrace it more than New South Wales.
You've been involved in the team following your retirement as a selector. You look back over the generations, basically, that you have been around Queensland Rugby League. Can you sort of put into words, or why? Try and explain. I think it may be inexplicable. How many of those players have come from regional areas, yourself included? The Queensland country has provided some of the superstars of the game, not only in rugby league, but in other sports as well.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's a great sporting culture within Queensland. I think it's nice and warm here. There's plenty of activity that you can have, whether you're playing tennis, golf, whatever. But I think part of it was, you know, and it goes back to the early days, the foresight of the management, Ross and the senator. You know, one of the first things they did was introduce Wayne as a development. And that was something that was unique. You know, Wayne came in to the Queensland Rugby League, and that was his, you know, introduction. He coached South and all that sort of stuff. But, you know, what he started there was coach the coaches. And I was part of that in the first, because I believed wholeheartedly in that grassroots things. And it formed an area where, they had this tremendous network of coaches that actually, gave some of the skills. Wayne was more than happy to share his, experience and knowledge with, people across the country. And I remember they used to have camps for the coaches, and we'd go down to the Tweed and do all that sort of stuff. And it was great. Queensland had started setting in process a mechanism to improve grassroots rugby league. And I think that's awesome.
What does it mean to you looking back now, and maybe at the time as well, it might have been a little bit different, that you were 5'8" in the original Origin side, and the man that many people say is the greatest player to have played for Queensland in the Origin arena was playing lock. What does it mean to you that you wore the number 6 in that first game?
Well, it's a great amount of pride, but, no way in the world. I'm nowhere near the player Wally was. But it was great, and I think it's a story in how you meld a team to find the best, mechanism to win. And as I do, we've gone through a lot of history, and I think back, and there's a number of players that played for Queensland that epitomise what it means to be a Queenslander. Sean Berrigan for one, guys that didn't get a lot. And, there's one there, Adam Mogg. I remember 2006, I think we spoke about that, the last game in Melbourne. And, we'd had a number of injuries. And there's a number of guys, Clinton Schifosky, Reece Wesser, those sort of guys are on the periphery. They come in and we beat New South Wales, 18-16 down at Docklands. And it was one of the most amazing games I've ever seen. I said, Darren Lock I think that was the pinnacle of his game. Lockie did everything that night. With Brett Tate and the rest of the crew, I think there was a number of great Queenslanders. And, Lockie can't do that without everybody else doing their job. And Moggy, I'd seen him play. He'd been part of the other system where we used to have the Queensland residents, and he was a regular in that. Good, skillful guy. But at that point in time, there was, GI and a number of other people playing in the centres. So, he didn't get an opportunity. But when he did, he more than performed. He was part of the glue that held that group together. And without him and players like him in 2006, that last game, we wouldn't have won.
Who had the biggest influence on your career?
I think Cracker. John McDonald, that's only because I grew up with his brothers and played. And Cracker came back from playing at Manly, and then he took over the Toowoomba side and formed a group, of good mates. I'm still good mates with Platsy and Rowan and all that sort of stuff. The only time that every year we'd have to play against them, and they used to terrorise me. I reckon they'd lose the ball on thing, and there'd be the chuckle out of it. And there used to be another bloke by the name of Gary Fisher. There's 3 of them in the back of their scrum. And they'd just say, we're going to belt Smithy every time the scrum went down. And it wasn't fun. You'd look at him and say, I'm getting to the centre, he's getting the ball. But it was lighthearted. They certainly didn't do anything, but they scared the life out of me.
How do you reckon the young bloke in Toowoomba, growing up with all those guys, would look back now at a career that saw him represent Queensland, playing the first Origin match, be an Australian and Queensland selector, playing one of the toughest competitions in the world in the New South Wales Rugby League competition for a number of seasons? How do you reckon that kid would look back on his career?
I think it's attributed to the Herb Steinuts of the world, the people that, and my dad, the attention to detail about all those hours passing to the left, passing to the right. Even though he was a basketball coach and thing, he played a bit of football, but, the basic fundamentals that even my coaches stressed when I was growing up, it was a great place to grow up in. You learnt some great basic skills about the thing. You learned about teamwork. You learned about mateship. I think that it's been a great journey, and I loved every minute of it. I still, sit back and look at some of the players that come through the system, and I think what a great privilege it's been to play for Queensland.
Well, FOG number 7, Allan Smith, thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on a wonderful career.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for watching this episode of the FOGS Queenslander podcast. If there's a FOG you want to hear from, leave a comment to let us know. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our videos.